The Earth, a planet once brimming with vibrancy and life, had fallen into the grip of an alien empire. The Xarvans, a race of ruthless conquerors, were unlike any force humanity had ever faced. Their ships, massive and sleek, cast shadows over the planet's surface, while their soldiers, tall, armored figures of terrifying precision, patrolled every corner. The cities that had once been beacons of human achievement now lay in ruins or were under tight control, each corner of civilization suppressed under the cold, calculating eyes of the invaders. But humanity was not one to yield without a fight. Captain Elara Kade stood in the dim light of a rundown bunker, staring at a map of what was left of her world. The holographic display flickered as she traced a finger over the red zones, areas where resistance was either non-existent or decimated by the Xarvans' merciless retaliation. She had seen it all: families torn apart, cities burned to the ground, loved ones lost to the war machine of the alien invaders. And yet, there was still a fire within her, a spark that refused to go out. She wasn't sure if it was the will to survive or the burning desire for revenge that kept her fighting. Maybe it was both. Elara, a voice broke through her thoughts, its tone hesitant but full of urgency. Dr. Aidan Brooks, a brilliant but reserved scientist, stood at the entrance to the bunker, holding a datapad in his hand. His sharp features were drawn tight, his dark eyes troubled. "I think you need to see this." She turned to him, her face hardening. "What is it?" Aidan stepped forward, pressing a button on the datapad. The map shifted, the red zones replaced by a series of coordinates, each marked with a stark, cold precision. "It's a Xarvan command ship, their flagship," Aidan said. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something more, something deeper. "It's orbiting Earth. I've traced it using signals from their communications network." Elara studied the coordinates, her pulse quickening. A Xarvan flagship meant one thing: a massive military presence. And if Aidan's data was right, it meant that Earth's last line of defense was about to be eradicated. The Resistance didn't have the firepower to go up against the Xarvans in their current state. But Elara knew better than to believe there was no way out. There was always a way, always a chance. Aidan's voice was quieter now. "There's more. The ship is carrying something they didn't intend for us to find." Elara's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Aidan hesitated, for a moment, his fingers running over the edge of the datapad. "I've decrypted part of their communication. There's a project they've been working on. It's unlike anything we've ever seen. I think they've developed a new weapon, a way to control entire populations. If we don't act soon, it'll be too late. A weapon to control humans." The word struck her like a punch to the gut. The Xarvans already controlled them through fear, through overwhelming military force. But this was something else, entirely. Elara narrowed her eyes. "So what's the plan? You and I take out their flagship?" Aidan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "We infiltrate the ship, get inside, disable their weapon, and learn what we can. This is our best shot." The weight of his words hung in the air, the danger palpable. To infiltrate the Xarvan flagship was no small feat. Their security was unmatched, and the risk of failure was higher than ever. And yet Elara felt something stir within her, an undeniable sense of duty, of defiance. The humans had been beaten, broken, and scattered, but they had not yet been conquered. Not completely. There was still hope, and with it, there was still the chance to take back their world. "We'll need a team," Elara said, her voice steady despite the swirl of adrenaline coursing through her. She turned away from Aidan and began pacing the length of the bunker, her mind working quickly. "We'll need the best soldiers, the best tech, and we'll need to be prepared for anything." Aidan nodded, the tension in his features easing slightly. "I'll get to work on the plans. We'll need to move quickly before they detect the breach." As Elara looked out at the desolate landscape of the Earth, a grim resolve settled within her. The world was broken, but it was not beyond repair. The Xarvans thought they had won. They thought they could break humanity, But they were wrong. Humanity wasn't done yet. In the heart of the bunker, Elara felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The resistance had never been about victory. It had always been about survival. But now, for the first time, victory was within reach. If they could sabotage the Xarvan flagship, they could cripple the heart of their occupation and perhaps, just perhaps, turn the tide of the war. But Elara knew that the stakes had just grown much higher. If they failed, the Xarvans would not hesitate to wipe them out completely. There would be no second chances, no more resistance. "Let's make this count," she muttered to herself, her gaze firm as she prepared for the battle ahead. The thought echoed in her mind as she turned toward Aiden, who was already preparing for the mission ahead, his hands moving with a purpose as he checked their equipment. Humanity had always been underestimated by the universe, but they were about to prove that being underestimated was their greatest strength. The Xarvans thought they'd control humanity, but now, humanity was leading the charge. The sleek shadow of the Xarvan flagship loomed above Earth, a chilling reminder of the empire that had forced humanity into submission. Its hull, glistening with the cold, flawless sheen of alien technology, seemed to pulse with an almost malevolent energy. The ship hung in orbit like a harbinger of doom, its weapon system scanning the surface of the planet below, waiting for any sign of resistance. Elara Kade stood in the command center of the human resistance, surrounded by a team of soldiers and strategists. The space was cramped, filled with outdated tech barely holding together, yet it hummed with a quiet energy, an energy that had sustained them through years of battle. Her gaze was fixed on the holographic map of Earth, which flickered in and out of focus, a poor imitation of the sophisticated Xarvan systems. "Are we sure about this?" Elara's voice was steady, though her insides were a roiling mess of uncertainty. Aiden stood beside her, his face drawn, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights of poring over data. He was no fighter, no soldier. He was a thinker, a man who saw the world through equations and formulas. But now he stood at the front of the war just as desperate as the rest of them. "There's no other option," Aiden replied, his voice tinged with a quiet intensity. "We need to hit them where it hurts. If we can disable their flagship even for a short time, it could throw off their entire command structure, and we might be able to buy enough time for the global resistance to rally." Elara felt the weight of his words. She had heard all the speeches, all the plans. But this was different. This was the heart of their enemy, and they were going to rip it out. "We go in, sabotage their systems, and get out. Quietly. Swiftly," Elara said, her voice hard, cutting through the tension that filled the room. "If we make it out alive, we'll have a chance. If we don't, we won't fail," Aiden interjected, his tone firm but laced with the faintest edge of doubt. He wasn't trying to convince her. He was trying to convince himself. Elara met his gaze, her eyes narrowing. "Then let's make sure we don't." The plan was simple, or so it seemed. Elara, Aiden, and a small team of hand-picked soldiers were to infiltrate the Xarvan flagship using a stolen cloaking device. Once inside, they would make their way to the central command hub and sabotage the weapon systems. The team had been briefed, but there was little comfort in knowing the risks. The ship was fortified with defenses far beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. It was a labyrinth of alien tech, and the chances of getting caught were high. But the stakes were too great to hesitate. Aiden worked quickly, his fingers flying over the controls as he manipulated the stolen cloaking device, preparing it for the mission ahead. "This will work," he muttered, almost as if trying to convince himself. Elara couldn't afford to show weakness now. "How long do we have before they detect the breach?" "Not long," Aiden said, pulling up a schematic of the flagship's security system. "Their sensors will scan for any unusual signatures, but with this cloaking tech, we should have a few minutes before they notice we're here. A few minutes is all we get. Then we make those minutes count." The team, fully geared and ready, stood in front of the makeshift transport ship, their faces shadowed by the weight of the mission. The silence between them was thick, each person lost in their own thoughts. Familiar, too familiar. They had been here before, sent on impossible missions with no guarantees of success. But this time, it felt different. The tension was sharper, the stakes higher. For the first time in a long while, Elara felt something she hadn't in years, the raw, gnawing fear that they might not make it out alive. But there was no turning back now. The transport ship shot through the darkness of space, a mere speck in the vast nothingness. Inside, the crew was silent, their minds focused on the task ahead. Elara's hands gripped the straps of her harness, her knuckles white. Beside her, Aiden was hunched over a console, his eyes scanning the screens as the ship approached the Xarvan flagship. "Almost there," Aiden said, his voice strained. Elara nodded but didn't speak. There was nothing to say. They were about to breach the heart of the enemy's power, and there was no telling what they would find inside. Suddenly, the transport shuddered and a low, ominous hum reverberated through the hull. Elara's heart skipped a beat. The cloaking device had failed. Just for a moment, Aiden's eyes widened in alarm. "Damn it! They've spotted us!" Before Elara could respond, alarms blared throughout the ship, red lights flashing like blood in the water. The flagship's defenses had detected the breach and their time was running out. "Abort!" Elara shouted, but it was too late. A blinding flash of light engulfed the transport ship, and the crew was thrown violently against their harnesses. The impact rattled their bones, but Elara's mind was already working through the chaos. "We're not aborting. We're going in," she spat, her voice cold as steel. "Aiden, get us inside. Now!" Aiden's hands flew over the console, his eyes wide with panic. But he didn't hesitate. The ship veered sharply, dodging the defensive beams that tore through the blackness of space, their flashing lights like meteors racing past. "We've got seconds before they lock onto us again," Aiden said, his voice tight with fear. "We'll make it," Elara said, though she wasn't sure if she was telling him or herself. With one last violent lurch, the ship breached the flagship's perimeter, slamming through the outer defenses and plummeting toward the inner docking bay. It was their only chance. But the ship was far from unscathed. The massive Xarvan ship had struck back, damaging their cloaking technology and shaking the hull beyond any normal endurance. Yet they were inside, barely. As the transport slid into the docking bay, Elara's breath came in ragged gasps. They had made it. But what awaited them inside would test every limit of their resolve. The doors hissed open, and the team spilled into the shadowy corridors of the Xarvan flagship. The air was sterile, unnervingly quiet, an atmosphere that felt too perfect, too controlled. Every step was met with eerie silence, and every corner seemed to hold the threat of discovery. Elara's hand tightened around the hilt of her weapon, but the weight of the moment felt heavier than the mission. She could sense it, the fear creeping in the unknown. She glanced at Aiden, who was already scanning the security systems, his eyes darting from screen to screen. "Stay sharp," she muttered, though it felt almost futile. They were deep inside enemy territory, and they were running on borrowed time. But there was no choice now. Humanity's fate had been sealed in the darkness of space. The only thing left was to fight for it, no matter the cost. "We move now," Elara commanded, her voice unwavering despite the terror churning in her chest. They stepped into the belly of the beast, ready to confront the horrors within, unaware that their arrival would set off a chain of events that would change the course of the war. The corridors of the Xarvan flagship felt like a tomb, silent, sterile, and unyielding. The walls shimmered with an almost living quality, pulsing in rhythm with the heartbeat of the alien ship. Every corner, every shadow seemed to whisper of hidden dangers and threats lying in wait. Elara's senses were on edge, her pulse quickening as the weight of their mission settled around her. The resistance team moved in tight formation, the sounds of their footsteps muffled by the strange, dampened acoustics of the ship's interior. Aiden was in the lead, his eyes darting between the security readouts on his wrist display and the hallways ahead. The air was heavy with tension, thick with the scent of alien metals and the underlying hum of the ship's power systems. They were in, but the real battle was just beginning. How much further? Elara's voice cut through the silence, her tone clipped efficient. "Not far," Aiden replied, his voice strained. "The central control hub is just ahead. I'm overriding their security systems as we go, but we're on borrowed time. They'll catch on soon." The sense of urgency in his voice sent a jolt through Elara's chest. They were too deep into Xarvan territory now to turn back, but every step closer to the control hub seemed to draw the eyes of the ship's security system tighter around them. As they neared a junction, Elara motioned for them to halt. Her eyes flicked to the ceiling where small black dots embedded in the walls blinked in rhythm, scanning, searching. Aiden's attempt to disable the sensors was working, for now, but even he knew how fragile their advantage was. "Cover me," she whispered. And without waiting for a response, she darted toward a nearby panel embedded in the wall. Her fingers moved with practiced precision as she pried open the access hatch and began to work. "We've got company," one of the soldiers, a man named Rook, hissed under his breath. His voice was tense, every word laced with warning. Elara didn't look up, focusing instead on her task. Her heartbeat quickened as she heard the faint sound of heavy boots on the metal floors, followed by the sharp hiss of Xarvan comm systems activating. The enemy was coming. "How much longer?" Rook demanded again, a note of panic creeping into his voice. "Almost there," Aiden said, his fingers still flying across his wrist console, his face pale with the strain of fighting both the ships, security and the clock. Just a few more seconds. Seconds they didn't have. A loud crash echoed from the far end of the corridor. Something massive had just slammed into a nearby wall, a mechanical sound that could only mean one thing. Xarvan soldiers, the terrifying armored enforcers of the alien empire, were closing in. "Move," Elara barked, snapping her head up as she slammed the panel shut. "They're onto us now." Without hesitation, the team sprinted down the corridor, the echo of their boots pounding in time with the rising tension in Elara's chest. Their steps were reckless now, driven by urgency and instinct, but they couldn't outrun the consequences of their mission. The Xarvans had discovered them, and the countdown had already begun. The first enemy came around the corner at the far end of the hall, a towering figure in black armor, its helmet sleek and menacing, its movements smooth and deliberate. It was one of their elite warriors, an enforcer with technology far beyond human understanding. The soldier's weapon, a strange, multi-barreled gun that hummed with lethal energy, raised in a blink. Elara didn't even hesitate. She darted forward, pulling out her own weapon, a hybrid, human-made plasma rifle, and fired, sending a pulse of energy directly at the Xarvan soldier. The shot hit its mark, but the armor absorbed most of the impact. The enforcer staggered back but didn't fall. "Fall back," Elara shouted, even as the return fire from the Xarvan soldier's weapon tore through the air around them, forcing the team to duck and scramble for cover. The walls sizzled with energy as each blast crashed against the metal. "We can't keep doing this," Rook growled, his voice strained. "There's too many of them." "Keep moving," Elara snapped, ignoring the stinging pain in her shoulder as a stray blast caught her. The armor protected her, but the hit sent a jolt of pain through her body. She gritted her teeth, pushing forward. "We need to reach the control room. Now." Aiden's face was a mask of concentration, but his knuckles were white as he gripped his data pad. "The override is working, but I can't guarantee it'll last for long. We need to get to that command hub or this whole mission goes down the drain." Aiden was right, but every part of Elara screamed that they weren't going to make it. The Xarvans had the advantage. Superior technology, superior strength. But what they didn't understand was humanity's greatest strength, their ingenuity, the ability to adapt, to think outside the box. They rounded a corner only to come face to face with more Xarvan soldiers, their guns aimed, their expressions cold behind their helmets. Elara barely had time to react. She dove to the side, pulling Aiden out of the way just as plasma fire erupted from the alien guns, the air around them sizzling with energy. The team scattered, taking cover behind a large bulkhead, their breaths ragged with exertion. Elara's mind raced. We can't take them head on, she said, panting as she assessed their surroundings. Aiden, is there a bypass to the main controls? Something we can use to disable their defenses? Aiden's fingers were already flying over his wrist console, his brow furrowed in concentration. Give me a second. Just 1 second. Elara's pulse thudded in her ears. The sounds of Xarvan soldiers searching for them echoed through the halls. They were close. Too close. Rook's voice came low and urgent. We don't have a second. The countdown was ticking in Elara's mind, the weight of failure heavier than ever. They had come this far, there was no going back, got it? Aiden shouted, his voice a sudden spark of hope. I've located a bypass to the central system. We can use the ship's own energy grid to send a surge into the security grid. It'll fry their systems long enough for us to get to the control hub. Elara turned to the team, her eyes sharp. Rook with me. We'll cover Aiden while he works. Everyone else, get to the control room. We move now. They had no time to second-guess themselves. No time for hesitation. They had made it this far, and they were going to finish it no matter the cost. The battle was just beginning, but Elara felt something shift in the air around them. They had broken the silence of the enemy, and now the Xarvans were starting to understand one thing: humanity wasn't going to roll over. Not this time. The final stretch to the command hub was chaos, blinding gunfire, near misses, and the growing realization that the team was being hunted, not just by the Xarvans, but by their own desperation. Yet in the midst of it all, Elara found something else, the stirring of hope. They might not win this fight, but they weren't going down without one hell of a fight. And that was enough to make all the difference. The door to the central command hub was just ahead. Elara's heart pounded in her chest like a drumbeat, every step a moment closer to their goal, yet each one felt heavier than the last. Her breath came in short gasps, adrenaline flooding her system. But the reality of what lay beyond that door kept her focused. She had known the risks. She had known the enemy was formidable. But as they reached the door, she realized something. This was the moment. There was no turning back. If they failed now, humanity would fall. Aiden moved past her, his fingers still flying across his wrist console, his brow furrowed in concentration. The makeshift path they'd created through the Xarvan defenses was a gamble, but there was no other choice. He had to crack their system, and now they had a chance. He was almost there. Ready? Aiden said, his voice steady. But beneath the calm was the tension of a man holding the fate of an entire species in his hands. Elara nodded. Once, but the words stuck in her throat. She didn't know if they'd make it. She didn't know if the plan would work, but she couldn't stop now. The command hub door opened with a hiss, the sounds of the alien technology filling the room. The low hum of the central system was almost alive, as though the ship itself were breathing. It felt suffocating. The team surged in, weapons raised, eyes scanning the room. Every shadow, every corner was suspect. In the center of the room stood the Xarvan control system, a towering spire of metal and light, its pulsating energy crackling in the air like static electricity. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. Focus, Elara shouted to her team. Get to the core. Aiden, now. Aiden was already moving, his fingers flying over his console as he tried to bypass the final layer of the ship's defenses. The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation, the quiet before the storm hanging heavily between them. But then the doors slammed shut behind them, sealing the team in the heart of the beast. A metallic voice, cold and devoid of emotion, rang through the chamber. Intruders detected. Terminate all hostiles. The sound of distant, heavy footsteps echoed through the room. Aiden's face blanched. They've locked us in. The security grid is re-engaging. We need to move now. The first wave of Xarvan soldiers stormed in, their massive armored forms filling the doorway like a wall of death. The soldiers' weapons hummed with a low, predatory vibration, ready to shred the resistance team into nothing. The first blast of plasma fire missed Elara by inches, the heat from the blast singeing her arm as she dove behind a metal console. The team scattered, taking cover in the corners of the room, but the sheer weight of the alien onslaught was overwhelming. Get to the core, Elara yelled again, her voice cut off by the violent explosion of gunfire and the screech of enemy plasma, weapons tearing through the air. Aiden was already moving toward the central spire, his body hunched over his console. His hands shook as he worked, sweat dripping from his forehead. Every second was a gamble now. If they couldn't take down the central system, the entire ship would lock them in. They'd be nothing more than corpses floating in the cold vacuum of space. Rook, the seasoned soldier, fired round after round at the oncoming soldiers, his eyes wild with desperation. His weapon discharged in short, rapid bursts, each one a heartbeat in the deafening chaos around them. "Cover Aiden," Elara barked, her eyes never leaving the enemy. "We hold them off, he cracks the system." Another explosion rocked the room. Elara barely had time to dodge, the air burning with energy from a near miss. She gritted her teeth, pushing forward. But then something in the corner of her eye stopped her. A shadow, too fast to be human, moved in a blur. She didn't recognize the figure at first, the sleek armor, the unnatural grace. And then she saw it, an elite enforcer. One of the Xarvans' deadliest warriors. This one was different, though. It wasn't like the others, not just a soldier, but something more. Something alive in a way that sent chills down her spine. The enforcer was moving toward Aiden. "No," Elara whispered, her stomach sinking. Before she could move, the enforcer reached Aiden. It didn't speak, it didn't need to. Its weapon, a multi-barreled energy rifle, was raised in a fluid motion, aimed straight at Aiden's chest. "No!" Elara shouted, her legs propelling her toward them before she had time to think. She dove, tackling Aiden just as the enforcer fired. The blast hit the floor beside them, sending shards of metal and energy crackling through the air. Elara felt the heat of it, but the blast didn't hit them directly. But the impact was enough to send them sprawling. Elara's vision blurred, with the force of the fall, her head ringing, her body aching. She rolled, her fingers finding Aiden's wrist, pulling him back to his feet. But the enforcer was already moving again, swift as death. Rook was beside her in a flash, his gun raised. He fired, but the enforcer was faster. The first shot missed, the second one deflected by the enforcer's own energy shield. "Get back to the core," Rook barked, his voice gruff but urgent. "I'll hold it off." Elara hesitated, her eyes locking with Rook's for a split second. There was no time for hesitation. She turned back to Aiden, grabbing his arm. "We can't lose this. We can't lose him." Aiden was pale, his face strained, but he nodded, once grimly. "I'm almost there," Aiden said, his voice tight with exhaustion. Just keep them off me for a few more seconds." Elara's heart hammered in her chest as she watched Rook engage the enforcer in hand-to-hand combat. It was brutal and quick, the two warriors clashing in a deadly dance, each one trying to outmaneuver the other, to strike a fatal blow. The sound of bone on metal rang through the room, and then, finally, Aiden's voice cracked through the noise. "I've done it. I've cracked the system," he said, his eyes wild with triumph. Aiden's hand slammed down on the console, sending a wave of energy surging through the room. The central core shuddered, and a low hum turned into a violent roar. The enforcer paused for a moment, its helmet cocking slightly as the room flickered with strange energy, its eyes, glowing with an unholy light, fixed on Aiden. But then it was over. A shockwave exploded through the room, crackling with raw energy, the lights above flickering and then dimming as the central system fried. The enforcer collapsed, its once perfect armor now scorched and broken, its body twitching once before going still. Elara stood frozen for a moment, breathing heavily, her eyes still locked on the fallen soldier. They had done it. They had done it. But victory had come, at a cost. The silence that followed the collapse of the Xarvan enforcer was deafening. No more footsteps, no more gunfire, only the hum of the disabled control core. But there was no time to breathe, no time to savor the victory. They had won this battle, but there was still one question that hung in the air, unanswered. Had they won the war? Elara turned to Aiden, her voice low and urgent. "We have to leave, now." Aiden nodded, his face drained, but his eyes blazing with the fire of a survivor. He didn't need to be told twice. As they moved toward the exit, the war was far from over. But they had sent a message the Xarvans would not soon forget. Humanity was not a species to be controlled. They were a species that would fight until the very end. The air on the Xarvan ship had gone still, an eerie silence settling over the command room. The energy from the control core was spent, its once thrumming power now a faint, flickering pulse. The threat of immediate death had passed, but in its place came the grim realization that the war had just begun. Elara took a deep breath, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind still buzzing with the adrenaline of the battle. They had made it out, just, but that didn't feel like the victory it should have been. Not yet. The blast doors ahead of them slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the sprawling dark expanse of the Xarvan ship's hangar bay. The massive hull of their escape shuttle gleamed under dim lights, a beacon of the possibility of survival. The team moved toward it with purpose, though each step felt like a weightier burden. "We're alive," Rook said, his voice low, rough with the strain of the last few hours. He glanced over at Elara, his expression unreadable. "That's something." Elara didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth of what they had done and what they had lost was too heavy to put into words. "Is it over?" Aiden's voice cut through the silence. He was pale, his hands still trembling slightly, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. He had cracked the Xarvan's central system, disabled their control core, but the cost of their victory was clear. The enemy hadn't been wiped out. The real threat, the larger war, loomed larger than ever. "No," Elara finally replied, her voice strained. "It's not over." They reached the shuttle, the hatch already open, its engines idling in the background. But before they could board, Elara turned to face her team, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the soldiers who had fought alongside her. Rook, bloodied but unbowed. Aiden, his fingers still white-knuckled around the datapad. And the others, heroes in their own right, each having given something to this cause. "We've won today," she said, her voice hoarse but resolute. "But it's only a small victory in a much larger fight. The Xarvans, they won't stop coming. We've crippled them, but they'll regroup, rebuild. This war is far from over." Her words were cold, but necessary. They had fought, yes, but the real battle lay ahead. Not just against the Xarvans, but against the fear that had been seated in their minds. The unknown was vast, and they had no idea just how far the Xarvans had spread across the galaxy, or what other alien forces might have joined them. Still, Elara's heart beat steady in her chest. The fear was there, but so was the conviction. Humanity was not the kind of species to cower in the face of overwhelming odds. They had adapted, survived, and now they would fight back. "Where do we go from here?" Rook asked, his voice rough as he glanced at the dim stars beyond the hangar bay. "What's the next move?" Elara took one last look at the ruined Xarvan command hub behind them. "We regroup. We find our people. We build alliances. We prepare for what's next. This isn't just about fighting. This is about taking control of our future." Aiden nodded, his gaze distant but resolute. "I've already started transmitting our victory data to the fleet. The Xarvans aren't just a threat anymore. They're an example of what happens when you underestimate humanity." Elara couldn't help the small, tight smile that tugged at her lips. "Exactly. They thought they could crush us, that we'd bend under their weight. But now—" She let the sentence trail off, the weight of their collective triumph hanging in the air. "Now we're the ones leading the charge," Rook muttered, the words carrying a weight of their own. "We've shown them what humans are capable of." Elara stood still, feeling the weight of everything they'd been through settle into her bones. They weren't the underdogs anymore. They had proven something today, not just to the Xarvans, but to themselves. But that didn't mean the journey was over. The hatch of the shuttle slid closed with a soft whoosh, and the low hum of the engines intensified as the ship began to power up. Elara secured herself in one of the seats, glancing at her team as they settled in around her. Her eyes met Aiden's, and without a word, they both knew the truth. The battle ahead would be more than they could face alone. The universe had more, enemies lurking in its shadows, some known, others unknown. But they weren't afraid. Not anymore. The shuttle lifted off from the hangar, breaking free of the Xarvan ship's gravitational pull, and the stars outside seemed brighter than before. The unknown stretched out before them, as vast and untamed as the galaxy itself. "Ready?" Aiden asked, looking up from his console. Elara didn't answer immediately, but when she did, her voice was steady and full of conviction. "Ready?" she said. As the shuttle shot into the blackness of space, her mind drifted to Earth, the home they were fighting to protect. The stakes were higher now, the galaxy itself a field of possibilities and dangers, but humanity had just delivered its first blow in a much larger war. They were no longer the victims. They were the ones with the power to decide their fate. And this, Elara realized, was just the beginning. The shuttle streaked through the black, expanse of space, its engines a soft hum beneath the quiet tension in the cockpit. Elara stared out the small viewport, her thoughts far from the stars twinkling in the distance. She wasn't just watching the endless void. She was trying to make sense of everything that had happened, of everything that would come next. Humanity had sent its first message and the universe had answered. The Xarvans had learned a painful lesson, but the real question now was whether their defeat would be enough to change the course of the war, or whether this new signal, the one they'd just intercepted, would be the next catalyst. Aiden sat beside her, eyes fixed on the controls, though his fingers moved with a precision that belied the unease etched into his features. He'd been quiet since they'd picked up the mysterious signal, a call from deep space that had seemed far too calculated to be a coincidence. "I don't like this," Aiden muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "It's too neat, like someone's waiting for us." Elara didn't disagree. The coordinates they'd received had led them to a distant, uncharted sector of space. The signal wasn't the frantic distress call of a ship in peril. No. This was different. It was deliberate. It was a summons. "I know," Elara replied, her voice low. "But we can't turn back. Not now." Rook's voice crackled over the comms, his tone slightly lighter than it had been during the tense moments of the battle with the Xarvans. "You know we could always just turn this thing around, right? No one's really counting on us to follow every damn lead, especially not when it smells like a trap." "I'm not backing down," Elara said firmly. "We've come too far. Humanity's fate is ours to shape now, not anyone else's." The shuttle vibrated slightly as it entered the outer bounds of the unknown sector. The stars outside began to stretch and distort as they neared the coordinates, the darkness of deep space pressing in around them. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence was deafening, filled only by the soft hum of the ship's systems and the low murmur of the crew moving around the cockpit and then, a flash, a sharp, bright light appeared in front of them, cutting through the darkness like a blade. It wasn't a star. It wasn't a ship. It was a gateway, an anomaly in space-time that shimmered with unnatural energy. The signal had led them to this. Aiden's voice came through, thick with disbelief. Is that a portal?" Before Elara could answer, the ship's systems began to beep furiously, a warning flashing across the cockpit display. Their engines sputtered, the unnatural energy of the portal pulling at them. The ship groaned, the tension rising as if the very fabric of space was threatening to tear apart around them. "Hold steady," Elara barked, gripping the control panel as the shuttle veered toward the opening. The crew braced themselves as the portal grew closer, the ship shaking violently. In the blink of an eye, they were no longer in the dark void of space. The universe around them twisted, contorted, as if reality itself was bending, and then, nothing. The ship was still. Silence that followed was more terrifying than the chaos of the storm they had just passed through. Aiden's voice was barely a whisper. "Where are we?" Elara stood slowly, her gaze sweeping over the sensors and screens. The readings were wrong. They were out of their galaxy, far beyond the familiar star systems they'd known. We're not in our universe anymore, she said, her voice tinged with awe. Not even close. Rook's voice came through the comms, strained. What do you mean, not in our universe? Are you saying we're stuck here? No, Elara replied, quickly. We're just… She trailed off, still processing the enormity of it. We're in someone else's territory. The screen flickered, and then the lights on the ship dimmed for a moment, casting long, eerie shadows across the cockpit. And then, as if in response to their arrival, another signal surged through the comms. A voice, alien and smooth, filled with strange harmonics, cut through the static. Welcome, Earthlings, we've been waiting for you. The words sent a chill down Elara's spine. Aiden's breath caught. Who the hell is that? Elara's eyes widened, her hand hovering over the ship's console. The voice wasn't just alien. It was ancient, powerful. It sounded like it came from the very fabric of the cosmos itself. She glanced over at Aiden, who was staring at the readouts in disbelief. The ship's sensors were overloaded by the sheer intensity of the signal. This wasn't just an alien species, this was something older. We need to talk, the voice continued, its tone strangely welcoming but ominous. We've been watching. You've made quite the impression. But now your real test begins. The connection fizzled briefly before stabilizing again. The voice, softer now, spoke again, its message clear. Come to us. We will see if you are worthy. Elara stood frozen for a moment, the gravity of the situation crashing down on her all at once. They weren't just in a new sector of space. They weren't just facing another alien race. This was something more, something that had been watching humanity for far longer than they could imagine. They've been watching us, Aiden said, his voice low. For how long? Rook cursed under his breath. That's not just a threat. It's an invitation. Elara's mind raced. The war against the Xarvans was just a small piece of something much bigger, much older. What had they just opened? What had they stumbled into? We have no choice, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of questions in her mind. We go. We find out what they want. We prove that humanity deserves its place in the universe. With that, Elara turned back to the controls, setting the course toward the heart of the unknown. They had taken the first step into a new chapter of the story. Whatever lay ahead, humanity would face it head-on. And no matter how ancient or powerful the beings they were about to meet might be, Elara was certain of one thing. They would never, ever be controlled again. The shuttle shot forward, the unknown, stretching out before them, wide, terrifying, and full of possibility. The future was waiting, and humanity was coming for it. But as the shuttle journeyed deeper into the uncharted sector, the signals from the mysterious force began to shift. New messages flickered across their communications console. The next challenge had already begun, and there was a part of Elara that couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of humanity's true test. A test that would push them beyond survival into something greater, but that would have to wait. For now, they had only one goal: survive.